Hi, I'm Conor Friedersdorf, a staff writer at The Atlantic magazine.
Hi, I'm Peter Suderman, a senior editor at Reason magazine.
Peter and I were also we were also colleagues at Culture 11 together years ago, and we're going to get kicked off by talking about Obama's management skills. I just wrote a piece in The Atlantic basically saying that this is going to be a line of attack that Mitt Romney is going to use against Obama. He's basically going to say, and already is saying, he's a perfectly nice guy, very likable, not a very good manager, not a very good steward of government, not very competent in the task that he's been elected to. And there's a bunch of things that the Romney campaign is already citing and that we're going to continue to see named. And one of them is the Fast and Furious scandal, where the Justice Department had this thing where they were running guns or they were allowing drugs or guns to go into Mexico in order to try and trace them back to drug cartels. And this blew up, and it's possible that Eric Holder knew about it. Maybe he didn't know about it. In any case, it went on under his leadership. There's no indication that this goes all the way to Obama, but still it was a part of his government. There's the GSA scandal, where the General Services Administration had this lavish retreat in 2010 in Las Vegas, already mocked on The Daily Show, and just kind of an indefensible thing. And the LA Times is reporting that actually waste in the GSA goes much deeper than this. The bigger issue here, I think, is that it's going to be very hard to make the case that Obama himself is corrupt in any way, that there isn't really any scandal that goes all the way to him. At the same time, if Romney is able to make the federal government look bad, it doesn't really matter if it's because of Obama's lack of management or whether it's because the federal government is just inherently unable to do so many things and to do them capably, because Obama's whole promise as a candidate was, if you put me in office, I am going to change the way that Washington works. I'm going to prove that government can do things efficiently, that it can do things capably. And a lot of Obama's policy proposals rely on the technocracy performing well. And so I think that Romney's definitely going to trot this out. I think Obama is vulnerable on these grounds, and I'm curious to hear what you think.
Well, one thing that I think is worth noting is how much of Mitt Romney's criticism of Obama is based not on complaining about the policies that Obama chose, but complaining and criticizing the way Obama chose to implement those policies and the particulars of the implementation. And if you read Mitt Romney's book, this is all over his book. On TARP and the stimulus in particular, Romney actually has pretty kind things to say about TARP under George Bush, and then says, but Obama blew it implementing it. Romney has pretty good things to say about the George Bush stimulus that preceded the big stimulus, the 2009 one that we got under Obama. And, he says basically Bush got it right. Stimulus is not necessarily a bad idea. And what Obama is getting wrong, in fact, he doesn't even say that the stimulus under Obama shouldn't have been passed. What he says is it should have been designed and spent differently. It should have been a lot heavier on tax cuts and a lot less spending. And so this is his whole, maybe not his whole criticism, but it is a huge part of his criticism. Is just that he's very critical of how Obama managed the technocratic details, and This is one of the reasons that I find Mitt Romney so frustrating, is that, in this period of ideological upheaval, in, sort of the Tea Party driven, the Tea Party era, in an era in which there are Republicans actually sort of flirting with, at least, being against big government. We have, Republicans have nominated someone who is basically just advertising himself as a better technocrat, and that's going to be a big part of Romney's pitch. Now, certainly Romney The other weird thing about this, though, is that Romney goes out of his way to try to make people think that he's really against all of these policies, but he always
Right.
he always sort of hedges, and he's always very careful with his language. And he'll run these ads about stimulus spending that are sort of huge. Dark and doomy and apocalyptic, and have like these big spending tickers, up in the corner, and people talking about
Right.
how the stimulus has failed them. But then, what's his actual critique is, I would have done it differently, and that's
Right.
it.
Yeah.
And that's the whole. That is maybe not entirely the whole thing, but it is a huge portion. I would venture to say the bulk of Romney's actual specific criticism of Obama as a leader is. He managed the bureaucracy and the details of government programs somewhat worse than I would have.
Right. Now, I'm someone who thinks that one problem with the federal government is that it's so big and sprawling, and that we'd be better off if we asked it to do fewer things and to do them better. And I presume that there would
I
be
totally agree.
that in any administration, no matter how capable the guy at the top is, there are going to be various scandals. Some of them are going to be related to the people that staff the federal bureaucracy that the president doesn't come in and wholesale change. Some of them are just going to do with like the Secret Service thing, for example, in Colombia. It's hard for me to imagine that anything personally about Obama led this to happen. At the same time, Obama is a guy that came in without any sort of executive experience. He was a law professor. He was a community organizer. Do you think, is Obama a capable manager, do you think?
So, one interesting thing about this is that liberals are making, not all liberals, but there is a species of liberal that is making a similar criticism, a variant on the Obama is an ineffective manager criticism. And they're basically, the idea is basically that Obama has been too passive with, say, the healthcare bill, where, he took the lesson from the Clinton years, where Clinton was, the administration was overly aggressive, and it was,
right.
One of the big lessons for reformers was the White House should take a back seat. Well, Obama and his team very much internalized that lesson and let Congress sort of dither, and very nearly did not get the bill passed, and perhaps did not get a bill that was as strong as a lot of liberals wanted. Things like having things like a public option. They ended up making all the deals with industry players. In my opinion, you were never going to get a public option, and you were going to have industry players involved in order to make this thing work. But certainly there are liberals who are making this criticism. I think the strongest version of it comes in Noam Scheiber's book, The Escape Artists, in which the picture that Scheiber paints of the administration's policy process and its economic team is one in which Obama is even in the small group context of White House meetings, is a fairly weak manager, and basically lets Larry Summers dominate the policymaking process in a way that put folks with liberal goals see as having damaged. Having made the administration less effective, damaged the policy process, because Obama wasn't willing to take as strong a hand as he should have. And so it's not simply that, you've pointed to some conservatives who are making, I think, totally overblown cases about how Romney is a terrible manager and blah, 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 and that he will certainly be compared to the business experience of Mitt Romney and all that. But there's also a liberal case, and I actually find the liberal case, I don't agree with what they want from policy. I think they are right, almost certainly right. The reporting on this is pretty strong, that Obama has not been an assertive, aggressive manager, and that it has weakened the policy process coming from the administration as a result. The thing that I would add to that, though, is that if you go look at what Romney did as a business manager, yes, he certainly has done more in the way of big organizational management than Obama has done. That's true. He has more experience there, but a lot of what he did was just sort of was some broad decision making. Here are our goals. Here's, here's a big decision that has to be made at the top level. I'll say choice A or choice B. And even more than that was that he was a deal maker. And there was actually a quote from one of his former associates in a New York Times profile of him in, I want to say, 2007, in which he basically said that, you can talk about Romney's business experience, and sure, it's good, and he made a lot of money for a lot of people, but mostly what he did was pick deals and then close them. He was a presenter and sort of a deal making advocate. He was a PowerPoint guy, and that's what he was good at, and not somebody who was there. It wasn't that he wasn't concerned with the details of implementation or anything like that, because the reports do indicate that he was to some extent, but mostly that his strength was as a deal maker and a deal finder. And that's very different than being, a competent manager of an organization the size of the administration, the executive branch.
Well, that's interesting because I often think that the idea that a successful business person is going to be a successful executive in government is overblown. At the same time, my instinct would have been to think that someone with Romney's experience in business would be the kind of businessman who would have transferable skills. And what I mean by that is just that it seems to me that the management consultant's mindset is to go into large organizations with which they're not very familiar and to make an assessment of everything from core strengths and liabilities to personalities and management structure and stakeholders and how they relate to one another and the personalities involved and the goals and how you make the goals that you want work with the personalities you have and the assets that you have. It seems, the critique of this sort of management consulting, of course, is that these people go into big companies that they don't know anything about and lay down some template. And I think that that's true in some cases, that management consultants don't serve every company they go into well. At the same time, if you're going to have a set of transferable skills, it seems like that's a pretty good one to have, related to, for example, being a senator or being a law professor, right? So, I mean, do you think that's wrong? I mean, why isn't a management consultant actually exactly the kind of person, not to say that being a good management consultant makes you a good president, but it seems like at least these are real transferable skills from business as opposed to an assertion of, I was successful in business, therefore I can run the government.
Well, I think one thing I would say is that management consultants are often not really leaders. They're people who are brought in to, do CYA in a lot of cases because the executives there can't make the hard decisions that they know need to be made. And so they bring in somebody else to say, well, we've got to cut a big part of the workforce, close down this line, this product line, whatever it is. And then the executives can point to the management consultant and say, see, he did that. That was his recommendation. Right, but again, I don't have any, So it's not, and so a lot of what management consultants do is just come in and tell people what they already know, and that's not decision.
Right, but that sounds again. I don't know. That sounds kind of like what presidents do, right? They come in and people in Congress already have these policies, and they kind of say, we should do this one, and they kind of herd all of the cats together and. Because they're president and because they got elected,
but
and because
the difference is that that presidents can't be the guy, or the president is the one who can't say the stuff that needs to be said in a lot of cases. He's not the guy who's sitting on the sidelines who's able to say the stuff that can't be said, which is what management consultants, often do. But you can look at Romney's tenure as governor, sure, it's of Massachusetts, and see what kind of lessons, what kind of experience he brought to bear there as a government executive rather than as a business executive. And it looks like he ran a relatively smooth ship. There were some budget decisions made that were relatively effective. They were not as effective as Romney has claimed they are. But he got the budget. Certainly, the state's budget took it from nearing crisis, or nearing crisis anyway, to in much better shape. But he also spent a lot of time doing, doing healthcare reform in Massachusetts, and basically ended up with the same thing that Obama ended up with, and
Right.
and so and that Obama or that Congress ended up with after being left to it by Obama, and so that is the kind of governance and management that Romney's skills and background actually gave a state when they elected him governor,
Right.
and so if you want to see what it is that he did and how it is that his experience plays, that's by far the best place to look. And in fact, it just sort of he looks like a very competent centrist, maybe not very competent. He looks like a competent enough centrist technocrat. Which, as I said, is kind of a surprising character to be in the Republican Party's driver's seat this year.
Yeah, I mean, so it's interesting that you keep pointing to these parallels between Obama and Romney. And I agree with the assessment that Romney is basically, I don't know if I would call him a centrist at heart. I would say that he has no ideology at heart.
Yeah.
That his ideology, I mean, I think I'm probably getting this from a piece that you've written, but his ideology is competence in a way. It is pragmatism. It is let's do it work. And even if I have to say, even if I have to mislead people in all sorts of rhetorical ways in order to do it, I'm comfortable doing this.
I think you can say you can really only say he has three real commitments, and that's that he's pro-America, pro-business, and anti-Obama.
Yeah, and so because of this, because having observed Romney, I think that he governed in a way that was reasonably pragmatic, and at the same time his rhetoric is all over the place. I find it very hard to know what he would do in office. I find it very hard to know what kind of appointments he would make, how much he would pander to the quote-unquote base. And I wrote a piece about Romney's foreign policy, and I've gotten a little bit of pushback online. I think Daniel Larison was disagreeing with me, for example. But I basically argued for agnosticism on Romney's foreign policy. My take was basically that it's very difficult to tell how hawkish he would actually be if he were to be elected. I don't buy the idea that his foreign policy and Obama's foreign policy would be exactly the same. I think we can see, looking to history, that administration, going from president to president, there are not always wholesale changes in foreign policy, but significant differences between presidents. I just don't know what those differences would be looking forward. I can't predict. For example, looking at Iran, which I think it would be a mistake to go into Iran, and the conventional wisdom is that Romney would be more likely to do it than Obama. That could be true. I don't know. And I guess that's my point. I'm not confident in my ability to assess whether Romney would be more or less likely than Obama to take military action against Iran. I'm not.
I almost don't think that Romney would be the one really making the decision. I think what you can say about him as a foreign policy person, he clearly has no prior commitments, just none. He does not subscribe to any particular school of foreign policy thought, but he is almost always in thrall to expert consensus and to not an extremist expert consensus, but one that in this he would pick from the sort of the middle of the Republican field, in terms of foreign policy advisors and administrators, I think. And so they would convince him, and he would do whatever the experts told him he needed to do, because that's how Romney works. And the only thing that would perhaps provide a check on that would be if there was some balancing he needed to do with Congress and with the public. The one thing that I think you missed in the piece, and that I think is important, is that we don't know much about his policy, sort of his broader commitments foreign policy wise, but we do know about his defense spending commitments, and he has just been harped on Obama's defense cuts, cutting back on naval spending, which is hilarious considering that in the same speeches he will also talk about problems with the naval procurement process and how incredibly inefficient it is. And he has said, he has said one of the most specific and clear things that Romney has said is, I want to set a floor of 4% of GDP on defense spending. And that is a big deal. And that in itself is a commitment, at least, to spending and to the business of war and defense and sort of the business community that surrounds it. And he is very clearly committed to aggressively, directly supporting them with taxpayer dollars. I
want to go back to something you said, which I thought was really interesting, that you think that that Romney is going to go along with whatever the consensus opinion is of his advisors, right? Maybe you're right. I mean, he does have this tendency, and so the question, I guess, maybe as close as we can come to guessing at what Romney's foreign policy would be, is to determine who he considers to be the people forming the consensus, right?
Right.
Because, I could certainly make the case, depending on the community of foreign policy advisors, there are people who think that attacking Iran would be catastrophic. My sense is that the bipartisan consensus of quote-unquote serious people is that the military option has to be on the table, and we have to, as a last resort, we have to use military to take out Iran's nuclear program. I kind of think that Obama, that's what he is leaning toward. I can't know that for sure again, but so who does Romney think of as forming the consensus? Is it just the Republican Party advisors? Because it seems like surely he has some deeper opinion. I mean, he's clearly pandering to the Republican Party. But
I don't think he does have a deeper opinion.
No?
I mean, I don't think he has. No, I don't think he has a deeper opinion, and I think he will go. I don't even know if we can guess as to exactly who he'll listen to, except that if I had to guess, what I would say is he won't go to the extreme ends of the hawkish, on the hawkish spectrum. He will go to he will find a crew of cautiously hawkish advisors, because that reflects his own sort of cautiousness. But he understands that as a Republican, he has to sort of put up this hawkish front. The thing that worries me a little is that if you go back and look at how he talked about foreign policy in 2007, in the last GOP primary race, I don't think his overall commitments were substantially different, but because foreign policy was a much bigger issue at that time, and because he was competing against John McCain, who has this great, hawkish credibility, he went out of his way to make himself seem much more hawkish and much more aggressive and interested in bombing people, firing, hunting down bin Laden. I mean, you remember I will kill bin Laden, I will kill him dead, we will find him and we will track him, and he would say stuff like that, and he would,
we will triple Gitmo.
Right, and the stuff he would say was just sort of ridiculous. It didn't actually commit him to any strong foreign policy view, except sort of this. He was looking for ways to paint himself, to get people to perceive him as aggressive enough, perhaps even more aggressive than John McCain. And so you could see, if foreign policy and if the Republican Party became concerned with being hawkish again and got back to that, you could totally see him once again adopting, remaking himself in a more aggressive way.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose for my purposes, I should just kind of pay attention to how excited the Weekly Standard seems about Romney, and to be frightened accordingly, or not. And But I really, if I had a better idea who would be better by my lights on foreign policy, I would probably suck it up and vote for that person. I'll probably, in fact, vote for neither Obama nor Romney because I don't think I'll be able to make the judgment, partly because not only do I not know who would be more likely to start more wars, but Obama, even if he is maybe slightly less likely to start wars, is guaranteed to continue this CIA drone assassination program in countries, various countries that we have not declared war on. And to just rope in Obama's management style one more time. But one thing I find astounding and that Romney won't exploit as an issue, but that I certainly wish someone would exploit as an issue because I think it's amazing, is that Obama has basically outsourced to the CIA the ability to choose kill targets without clearing it with anyone else.
Yeah.
And in fact, the CIA is able to do this in a secret program that the government won't acknowledge exists, and they're able to do it without knowing the identity of the people that they are killing. And if there's ever a recipe for disaster and unaccountable killings, my God, you're just going to let the CIA kill whoever they want without knowing who they are and answering to no one, without clearing it first with anyone. It seems insane to me, and it seems like an obvious failure of oversight and management. It seems like the kind of thing where if the wrong person ever dies, it could be a scandalous thing where everyone says, "How could this happen?" And yet, it's public information, and no one seems very concerned about it now. So.
Well, this is the problem with presidents and presidential candidates and people who want to be president, is that you generally don't find them running on a platform of let's reduce executive authority and
right.
And so I don't think that I think there's virtually no chance that Romney would not continue with that program and with the drone strikes, et cetera, because Republicans have not made it a big issue, and Romney is not going to take the lead on making that a big issue. He is going to. He will absolutely wait if the Republican base, decides that they hate that and wants Romney to make it a big issue. Maybe then he will, but until then, I don't see that happening.
Yeah, you're probably right. I mean, certainly presidents tend to continue the executive power excesses of their predecessors. I do think that that who Romney ends up with as advisors matters a lot because although you wouldn't know it from the rhetoric of Republican candidates, the Republican foreign policy establishment is pretty deeply divided. You saw this with, just think of Dick Cheney and Colin Powell, right? Unfortunately, it seems like from the way he talks, Romney is more likely to go with a Cheney-esque figure than a Powell-esque figure. But I don't know. We'll see. I guess
I would, if I had to bet, I would say it would be somewhere in between. That we won't see the Cheney-Bolton contingent with substantial power. Perhaps they'll have a representative, but that we won't see them with substantial power. Instead, Romney will do his best, as he always does, to split the difference and not have to make a choice until the absolute last moment.
Well, let's move on and talk about the Buffett Rule. Something that in my teenage years I would have been thrilled to hear about, but alas, it is Warren Buffett that we're talking about, and it is a law about taxing millionaires, and maybe you can explain the details because you know them better than I do.
Okay, so the basics on this is that Warren Buffett, who's an incredibly rich investor, has been advocating for higher taxes on extremely wealthy, on high earners, on people who make more than $1 million a year. He's been saying, raise my taxes. I pay tax, my actual tax rate, not the dollar value, but my tax rate is lower than my secretary's. There's a little bit of speculation about whether that's true or not. I don't know. I don't think it matters. And so the Obama administration, in preparation for tax day, Biden and Obama have been running around the country giving speeches, arguing in favor of what they're calling the Buffett Rule. And the Buffett Rule is a special tax that would hit the highest of high earners, people making like $1 million a year or more. And what's interesting to me and sort of irritating Well, maybe I should start this way. When it comes to tax policy in general, I don't know whether to be more irritated with the Obama administration or with Romney and his campaign. The Obama administration is running around talking about a policy that is designed to hit the high earners, a specific class, a small, narrow, specific class of earners differently than everyone else. And they're talking about it, and Joe Biden will say the whole point of this is just to make sure that that everything is equal, and that no one is subject to a different set of rules and tax policy rules as anyone else. And in fact, they're specifically proposing a rule that would subject one class of people to different rules than everyone else. But even worse, the worst thing about this is that it's just such a transparent gimmick policy, and it's not. There was no chance that the Buffett Rule was ever going to pass, or not this time of year, not anytime soon, not before the election. And yet the Obama administration has chosen to make this an issue, not even, I think, because they really think it's awesome policy, but because it is a not so subtle way of drawing attention to the fact that their first likely and now basically certain opponent come November is very, very wealthy. And so that's the whole thing, behind this, is that it is a not very well disguised political attack on Mitt Romney for being a rich guy. I mean, they've basically admitted this. The New York Times had reported aides to Mr. Obama are hoping Biden's speech on the Buffett Rule will begin to shift the debate about taxes on the wealthy from an abstraction to one that focuses directly on Mr. Romney. The whole point is, hey guys, Mitt Romney is rich. Did you know that?
Well, okay, so before I respond, I have a couple of questions. One, I don't quite understand how this would be a special category of tax.
They're adding a new layer to the existing messed up, incredibly overly complex tax system. A tax system that Obama
but the whole tax system, right? The whole tax system treats people differently based upon their income, right, among all sorts of other, all sorts of other classifications. Right. So I understand that this would be
progressive taxation exists. Yes,
it would be an additional difference, right? This category of people is going to be taxed in this way, but it seems like every tax law is this category of people are going to be taxed in this way. It doesn't seem uniquely punitive to a special class any more than, the home mortgage deduction is uniquely helps and is punitive to different classes, or making over X amount a year is uniquely punitive to the people over that threshold. Like, how is this a special tax on millionaires different from other special taxes on everyone?
I think what I would say on that is that I'm not saying is that the rest of the tax system, yes, does treat different people differently, but the rhetoric that is surrounding this is about how the tax system shouldn't, and how the tax system should be more equal, and treat people and subject different every individual to the same set of rules, and yet what they are doing is adding a rule to the system that treats a narrow class of people differently just because of their income level. And so so it's not to say that there are not already disconnects within the tax system, but they're complaining that it's too complex. They're complaining that that people need to be treated basically the same, and then they are adding complexity and adding narrow exceptions, and going out of their way to do that.
So, and one more question. So my understanding is that part of the reason for this discrepancy, part of why Warren Buffett or someone like him, if it's not true for him, pays more in taxes, or less in taxes, a lower rate than his secretary, is that he is getting a lot of his income from capital gains, right, as opposed to straight income. And so my question is, for the class of millionaires who are getting their money from wages, say someone is a CEO making a straight salary of $3 million a year, right? And not stock options, just straight salary. is that millionaire going to pay a higher rate under the Buffett rule, or is this just going to affect millionaires who are paying a lower rate on a high proportion of their income because they're taking it as capital gains rather than as straight salary?
I think the administration is kind of playing games with this. The issue, you're right, is that capital gains are taxed at a lower rate than regular income. And if what the administration wanted to do was, if the administration wants to raise capital gains tax rates, then they should just say that. And they should they should propose doing that. But then they get tagged. They don't want to do that because that allows them to get tagged as tax hikers in a way that we're only going to tax the super wealthy, the super high earners, because the class of people who's hit is a relatively small class of people who, it doesn't have sort of the same kind of populist appeal. Getting rid of, changing the capital gains tax rate versus the Buffett rule. And so, so look, if that's what they want to do, then that's what they should, and then they should say, let's change the capital gains tax rate. And I am not against, in principle, raising more revenue. Raising additional revenue, certainly in the context of the deficit spending that we have right now, I would much rather be paying for what we are spending rather than borrowing, a fifth of our four or more, 20 to 40% of our annual budget. We should figure out how to pay for what we're spending, or pretty close to it. But that's not what the administration isn't proposing. Honest policy that it thinks is a great idea that will help fix deficit spending problems. Well, instead, what they're doing, they're proposing a policy that is designed to call attention to call populist wrath against their election year opponent.
This seems election driven to me too. Yet I am not. I don't know. I guess I'm ambivalent about it because one thing that I don't know is whether people making, whatever the threshold for this is, $1 million or more, I guess, or whatever it is, are those people paying the right tax rate now? Should it be slightly higher? Should it be slightly lower? I don't really have a clear answer to that question. I don't really know how I would answer that question. Perhaps it would be to look at tax rates and try and make some calculation about fairness. Perhaps it would be to look at tax rates and make some calculation about just a pragmatic calculation about maximizing productivity in the overall economy. And one thing that's frustrated me about the debate over the Buffett rule, such as I've seen it, is that, as far as I can tell, that question is completely unaddressed. So I take your point about there are, if what the Obama administration wants to do is change the tax structure of capital gains, then they ought to do that. And I agree with that. But at the same time, it seems like there's all sorts of legislation, of policy initiatives that, it just is framed in a way that is political because that's the way our system works. And so trying to figure out, is this a good policy or bad policy? I've seen a lot of people write about how this wouldn't raise very much revenue. Right. And I think that is, I don't know.
It doesn't fit, even under the best assumptions, it doesn't fix much of the deficit spending problem. And so under the best assumptions, under the most favorable assumptions, it raises roughly $160 billion over 10 years. Now, think that we have been, the deficits have been running $1 trillion plus since Obama took office. Next year, they're going to run almost $1 trillion, $160 billion over a decade. Again, most favorable assumption here, and depends on sort of what your baseline is. $160 billion over a decade. It's not nothing, but it is not. It's pouring a couple of grains of sand into a bucket. It's not even coming close to filling it up.
Yeah, I have no doubt about that. I mean, I guess I'm torn about the larger question of, whether it's raising revenue in these ways that don't raise that much revenue but raise some, or whether it's cutting spending in ways that don't tackle entitlements but does shave off a little bit of money from this agency or that, right? Are those little efforts, which are often politically driven, are they worth it? And
I really don't. I don't think they're worth it because, first of all, they're not seriously intended to go somewhere and to be effective as policy. So you can tell that because they wouldn't do much if they were enacted. You can also tell because there's no real assumption on the part of anyone who knows how Washington works that policies like these are ever going to pass. The whole point of them is to jab your political opponents, not even to make the small difference that you could maybe say it might make. And so
it seems to me that the
frustrating about that, and so irritating about policy proposals. These aren't even policies, but proposals like this.
Yeah, I share your irritation with the failure to address the real problems, and I share your irritation with this sort of posturing. I certainly think it's worth condemning, even though it goes on all the time. At the same time, my frustration extends to the opposition in a way too, because I think that part of the reason these things are politically effective, right, is because when the Republicans want to cut something that isn't going to make a huge difference in the deficit but is kind of indefensible on the merits, right, or when the Democrats want to raise revenue in some way that isn't really going to affect the big picture either, right? Like what the Obama administration is highlighting here is we propose this millionaires rule, and the entire right of center will go to the mats against this thing. This is what they care about, is protecting millionaires, right? This is where they're going to fight. There's a lot of places they could fight. This is where they're going to fight. And it's the same thing when Republicans propose spending cuts, right? And there'll be a category of spending, or, it doesn't even have to be spending cuts. It could be like some union benefit or some like tort reform. And it's a thing that wouldn't make a big overall picture, but what it does is it's politically effective because it highlights the degree to which the other side is irrationally attached to some special interest or some ideological dogma. And so I guess my frustration goes beyond the people proposing these things. It extends to the people opposing them too in many ways. And I don't have strong feelings, again, about the Buffett Rule in particular, because I don't know enough about tax law, like whether I think that the rates on $1 million or more are actually at the right place. For all I know, I could think they're too high or too low. But I would like to see at least some of the debate be focused on the merits of, like, are the rates at the right place? Because if we didn't debate the merits of the policy every time something is offered up for mostly political reasons, then we would just never debate the merits of policy at all.
So, two things I would say on that. The first is that like when I started this, I said that that I couldn't tell who I was more irritated with.
So, that's true.
Republicans
We're both perpetually irritated at everyone.
Republicans are not any good on tax issues either. The rank and file of the Republican Party in Congress continues to insist, basically as a rule, that tax cuts always and forever pay for themselves. They almost never do, especially in our current tax environment. And Mitt Romney in particular, and I wrote a post about this, sort of comparing, Obama is using tax policy sort of as a political weapon, as just sort of to jab his opponent. Romney, on the other hand, is putting forth tax schemes that almost certainly won't work, that leave huge, that just sort of have huge gaps in them. You can't figure out. He won't tell you what it is that he would actually do, and it's always crucial parts of his plans, and especially the case on tax plans. He's relying on dynamic assumptions, basically that tax cuts will partially pay for themselves, and he's also just leaving out sort of what tax loopholes and spending in the tax code he wants to cut to pay for the big tax cuts that he proposes. And this is on top of not telling us what sort of spending cuts he wants to make to pay for some of his other big budget plans. And so Romney has been incredibly evasive, incredibly vague. He's not using his tax proposals nearly as much as a political weapon. To some extent he is, but not nearly as much. But he is totally using tax policy to pander to a base that wants something totally impossible out of the tax code, which is huge tax cuts with no real spending cuts to match them, and somehow or another also a smaller deficit. And you can't just cut taxes a huge amount, not really cut spending, and get a smaller deficit. It doesn't work. And so that sort of brings me to my second point, which is you talked about what is the correct rate for people who make $1 million or people who make $200,000
right,
or people who make $50,000. That's a great question. I'm not sure I have the easy answer, but the answer is that one of these two things is true. Either we are spending too much or we are taxing too little, somehow or another. The problem is that the amount that we're bringing in and the amount we're spending are out of balance. And this is, if you read, the majority of the CBO reports on this stuff, they will. It's pretty clear that CBO foresees economic drag if we don't, close the gap. And the long run best option is close the gap sooner rather than later. And look, for everybody who says, well, we shouldn't raise taxes to pay for the spending, I'm not really in favor of spending more. On the other hand, if we're going to spend that money anyway, we ought to pay for it now rather than paying for it later plus interest.
Yeah, I think that the Grover Norquist approach to these things has been proved an utter failure. I think that the effect of holding the line on taxes and not spending is to make the government goods you get seem cheaper than they actually are.
It's a subsidy on government. Deficit spending is a subsidy on government, and it's probably why we have as much spending as we have, is because it's so easy to do without collecting the taxes to pay for it.
Yeah, and this maps onto also what Rachel Maddow argues in her book about how we ought to make it harder to go to war. Basically, that if we had to pay for wars with new spending, with new taxes, rather than finance them through deficits, we would be less likely to go to war. And I think there's something to that, too. Let's see here. So let's close off by talking about the wide world of journalism. I just put out my annual Best of Journalism list for 2011.
An excellent list that everyone should read and take in as soon as possible.
Yeah, so I hope you will link it. It's over at Byliner this year. And basically, I started this 4 or 5 years ago, and I think I did it on the American Scene the first year, and I just put up a bunch of the long-form pieces that I really enjoyed over the previous year, and the list has kind of grown over the years, and now for the last few years, it's been about 100 pieces. And I'm always curious to compare my list, which I read a lot of pieces. I do this Best of Journalism newsletter twice weekly. I send it out to my subscribers, and so I send out 6 pieces a week. I probably read 4 times that many, 5 times that many, just to get to those pieces that I distill and send out. And I'm always curious to compare my picks with the National Magazine Awards, with the Pulitzer Prizes. And there's a couple big picture trends that I notice. One is that I tend to not have very many newspaper stories. And I don't know. I always have a lot of pieces from the New York Times, sometimes, a mix of the New York Times Magazine and the New York Times. I occasionally have a couple of LA Times pieces, a couple of Wall Street Journal pieces. The Guardian made an appearance this year. But there's a lot of newspapers out there, and it isn't that I don't read them. I mean, I go on a lot of sites like the browser, like Arts and Letters Daily, cruising for different pieces. I read pretty widely. I follow a lot of links. I sometimes visit newspaper websites other than the big newspaper websites. And I just think that more and more magazine journalism has a huge edge in how enjoyable it is to read, a huge edge in the depth of reporting. And it's not to say that there isn't some great stuff published in newspapers, but I think that there's definitely this huge shift. Another thing that I've noticed, and I don't know why this is that my list this year is more gender balanced than the National Magazine Awards. I know this only because people pointed out to me. Ann Friedman, who's the editor of Good Magazine and who I knew back in Washington, D.C., has an ongoing project to get more women writing in journalism.
Right.
And she, when the National Magazine Awards come out, she does a byline count and notes who are men and who are women. And I have kind of ambivalent feelings about her project. I want women to have, I want women's voices to be part of journalism, to be part of political journalism too, and I want them to have completely equal opportunities. At the same time, I think that the level where the kind of things that you can do to make a difference happen are like when people are deciding which direction to take their careers very early in their careers, when they're deciding whether they're going to write about politics. I think one factor that's been huge influencing whether women write about politics or not is, a lot of men who are writing about politics now came up in the age of blogs. And the dynamic when a woman starts a blog is a lot different. You get terrible sexist comments, and not just sexist comments, you get sexually explicit comments, constant comments about your appearance, the kind of things that men just never get when they start blogging, and that I think was a huge disincentive to a lot of women to keep in the game of political blogging. Some did, but I think a lot of women I know personally dropped out for that reason, and so I have to think that a lot more women generally dropped out for that reason. So that seems like the kind of factor to me that is really what's at play here, and I worry that focusing on the gender gap in the National Magazine Awards at like the far other end of the spectrum, right? It makes the problem seem as if it's just sexist editors deciding not to commission from the right people or something, when in fact the supply of women writers is a lot different than the supply of male writers in certain realms, right? But that said, I think one of the reasons, so I didn't go out to have gender equity in my list, and I'm not saying I have anything like 50-50, it's just more equal than the National Magazine Awards were. But I think one reason for that is that I tend to like essayish writing of the kind that Katie Roife does, of the kind that Caitlin Flanagan does at The Atlantic, of the kind that a lot of people do wonderfully in all sorts of places. And I also think that
you have a bias towards scene setting, character building, and critical consideration.
Yes, and I think that those things, and I think some of the subjects that women writers seem to write about more often are every bit as valuable and important as the kinds of things that, say, Matt Yglesias writes about, that some women write about wonderfully, but that not as many women write about. And so I'm curious about to what degree judgments about what kind of journalism is important play into these things. I guess that's all I have to say about it, but I'm curious of what you think of the whole world of journalism awards.
The one thing I thought of while you were explaining some of that was that it's probably one reason anyway why you pick fewer newspaper pieces probably has to do with some of your bias towards essayish, magazine feature style writing that is focused on heavy on scene, heavy on character, sort of that is a little bit more novelistic in certain ways, and that newspapers, especially smaller newspapers, don't focus on that sort of thing, and that really it's only a handful of the much larger newspapers that tend to do that sort of writing frequently, whereas magazines tend to do a lot more of it.
I think most newspaper writing isn't very good. Not that most newspaper writers aren't very good, which I think a lot of times I see newspaper writers freelancing somewhere, and I think, wow, this is awesome. Their newspaper should let them write like this more. And
the demands of newspapers are there in a lot of ways just to deliver information, right? Not to provide pleasurable reading experiences. Information is a lot more valuable than the pleasurable reading experience. I mean, you can sell information a lot easier than you can sell sort of the luxury of, oh, this is a great sentence.
Well, I guess I would just say that it doesn't take a beautifully crafted sentence in in the way that Hemingway or Joyce or something would craft a beautiful sentence, right? It doesn't take that to make it enjoyable. Sometimes it just takes energy or departure from a formula. It takes nothing more than not being just so dreadfully boring. And I think that newspapers have this idea that the worst thing that you can do in newspaper copy is to inject the writer's voice into it, and that this cuts against the objectivity that they want to have. And when I read political coverage, for example, to take a category of news that I read all the time, I'm much more interested in reading something in John Dickerson's voice or Chris Beam's voice than I am in reading just straight AP copy. And I think readers are sophisticated enough to read a story with voice in it and to not and to come away exactly as informed as they do reading AP copy. And so I think that newspaper writing is going to die, and that successful newspapers are already moving away from it, are already giving their writers the ability to write with more voice. And I think that insofar as newspapers don't do that, people are just going to read alternatives that are more enjoyable.
I'm not sure how much I agree with you, given, the growth, a lot of the growth in journalism in terms of what's actually selling and successful is trade press publications, which are not known for their great, their great literary, they're there because they provide good information. And, there's this mindset that's totally understandable, can be frustrating, but this mindset within a lot of journalism that what you're doing is you're creating a product, and you're creating a product to sell, and that's what the reporter's job is to do, is to create a product. And that product frequently is, how can we deliver information to busy people in the most concise and efficient and accurate way possible? And I don't know that I quite agree that that the growing market is going to be for a strong voice. I think you look at what's a lot of what's growing, and it's fast information delivered. You have to deliver it in a voice that's readable and that people want to see. But look at something like Politico, which is not. They don't. They make their stories sort of flashy on purpose, and sort of and they're designed to reach out and grab you and sell you on, here's the conflict, here's the piece of information we're delivering, whatever it is.
Sure, and they're less formal than newspapers.
There's a house style, sort of a basic house style, and they try to fit everything into that. And it's a product, and it's there to read because they want to make you want to read it and need to read it. And it's not about the pleasure of reading, sadly.
I don't know. I think it is partly. I would rather read a Politico article than something containing the same information in USA Today.
But but all they've done is just change the basics of the house style. There's still, yes, you do have bylines there that people with bylines that are given more leeway and that have more of a personal brand for sure. But that's not the general rule to sort of their. That's not how. When I read their healthcare, their industry coverage. Their industry coverage is geared towards people who are towards the lobbying industry, towards businesses that need to know what's going on in Congress, and their first priority is what do I need to know, not is this enjoyable to read. And that's where a lot of the money is coming from to fund all this stuff.
Well, I certainly agree that commodity news isn't going to go away, and it's going to exist in various industries, and the emphasis is going to be on the news. But I would say that one thing that Politico does, and that I think kind of makes my point, that is a move away from what traditional newspapers do, is that Politico recognizes which of its items are commodity news and are there to, get out before anyone else breaks them, right? And which of its pieces would benefit from being written in a voice, from being written on one of its blogs, from being written under a byline from a personality, right? And the way that newspapers do that, right, is that they cover all news in the same voice. Then they have their columnists who aren't necessarily writing about anything except their personality. It's like completely injecting their personality. And I think that one thing that you see from Slate, from Salon, from The Atlantic, in all of Reason 2, in all of the online stuff that we publish, is this middle ground where some of the items I write are straight news. They're just I noticed this thing, and I think that the readers of the Atlantic Politics channel will be interested in knowing this thing. And I'm not really injecting my opinion into it, but my voice is still in it. And some things I write are, very much straight opinion, right? But I think that the dichotomy that newspapers impose on things, it is either opinion or it is news. And these are very distinct categories, and we have very different rules for them. I think that attitude, it short sells what voice can do in news writing. I think it also short sells the quality that should be demanded of opinion writing. I think sometimes newspapers have a tendency to say, oh, this is opinion. It doesn't have to have rigor because of the way that they've segregated facts and opinion. I don't know. I would guess that especially because young people who are staffing the lower jobs at newspapers have come up in an environment where they were able to put their voice into stories and like putting their voice into stories. I think there's going to be pressure both from readers who are used to this kind of thing now and from writers who are staffing these newspapers to inject more voice into newspapers. But we shall see. Only time will tell.
Yeah. Final thought on this is just that I sort of think you may be right in one way, which is just that in many ways the bastion of standard news writing, of sort of voiceless house style newspaper writing, the biggest location of that is actually in the small and mid-sized papers throughout the country that are going to end up, a lot of them, shutting down or cutting their staffs dramatically. And so you may just see less of that surely as a result of having fewer people employed in smaller markets doing straight news reporting. And so they're just that may be a big cause of having a lot less of that style of writing being published on a regular basis.
Right. Well, we should close. We're at about an hour, but it's been fun, and we should do it again sometime.
Indeed. Very nice talking to you, sir.
Yeah, likewise.